Okay. Chairman Bell, Chairperson Wilk, members of the committee. My name is Lou Thompson. I'm chairman of the peer review group. Other members of this group, Marty Wax, Stacy Mortensen, and Gary Gallegos, are known to many of you. They're prominent transportation people in the state. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I believe this hearing comes at a very important point in the development of high-speed rail in California. Decisions made by the legislature in this session could have a major impact on the timing and eventual success of California's transportation network and on the role of high-speed rail within that network. As you may know, the peer review group was created in Proposition 1A to advise the legislature on high-speed rail developments, including business plans and funding plans published by the High-Speed Rail Authority. We sent a letter on January the 14th commenting on the significance of the expressions of interest received by the authority when it requested the ideas and reactions of the private sector to investing in the project. We then sent a letter on the 25th of March commenting in some detail on the draft business plan. The authority will also be shortly providing to you a set of jointly developed dashboard indicators, which we think are very useful in terms of giving you a broad overview of how's the project going and where and when you might want to start being worried. In these letters, we emphasized a number of important issues. First, the new construction sequence adopting an iOS north to San Jose rather than south to the LA basin was driven by financial limitations, and it leaves Bakersfield to Palmdale Gap unfilled until the completion of phase 1. The peer review group supported the authority's decision in the 2012 and 2014 business plans to complete the southern gap first, and we continue to believe that filling that gap should be a priority if funding limitations are lifted. Second, if the initial northern iOS is completed as planned, the lack of a connection into Bakersfield and the lack of a fully functional connection from San Jose to the Trans Bay Terminal in San Francisco will limit system ridership and passenger revenue. Completing that those connections should be a priority. At the same time, implementation of the blended system service approach on the peninsula poses a number of complex and as yet unresolved institutional and funding issues that we believe the legislature should keep itself fully informed about. Third, the ability of the authority to finance the initial iOS north to San Jose depends on important assumptions about, first, significantly lowered construction costs based on favorable experience and some significant redesigns. Second, the timing and amounts available of Proposition 1A funding, which is subject to litigation, as we know. Third, the ability to spend the full amount of the federal ARRA money, which, as you know, if not spent, parts not expire on September 30th, 2017. And most important, the authority's ability to securitize cap-and-trade funding when needed in the future. Chairman Richard mentioned the year roughly 2022, and that amount is $5.237 billion. The legislature will want to assess the validity of these assumptions, especially because securitizing cap-and-trade funding apparently requires action by the legislature. This is not an assumption, in effect, it's a request for action. Fourth, completing the full connection from Bakersfield to Trans Bay will depend on $2.9 billion in new funding not currently identified, though the authority suggests applying for federal funds. The outlook for such a request is not clear. And 5, despite demand, revenue, and cash flow projections that are significantly more favorable than those included in the 2012 and 2014 business plans, completion of the full Phase 1 system from Anaheim through LA Union Station to the Trans Bay Terminal in San Francisco continues to face roughly a $19 billion gap in firmly established funding out of the total $55 billion cost even after projected private investment is included. This is not a new issue, as there has been a funding gap beginning with Proposition 1A and continuing in all business plans, but it should not be ignored. The legislature could most significantly influence the outcome by clearly establishing an adequate and consistent funding stream for the authority so that it could securitize its income streams and extend availability payment guarantees to potential private sector partners. Expansion of federal participation in the form of RIF or TIFIA loans also would require reliable repayment mechanisms that the authority does not now have. Extending the cap-and-trade program beyond 2020 and defining the authority's share of the proceeds would deal with at least part of the funding objective, but other mechanisms also could be considered, such as granting the authority the ability to extend availability payment guarantees or other financing mechanisms such as fuel taxes, sales taxes, or dedicated taxes such as those used to finance BART. We emphasize that this is not solely a funding issue, it is also a commitment and a priority issue. If the state wants to follow the process through to completion, there would be many ways to put a financing package together. As a final point, the peer review group has repeatedly emphasized that if this massive project goes ahead, there will be a need for very thorough oversight to ensure that the promised benefits emerge and the potentially large risk to the state are managed. The legislature may want to consider creating a select committee to ensure oversight continuity. In addition, we believe this requires a dedicated and continuing oversight effort with adequate resources, possibly lodged within the LAO, though the exact location can certainly be discussed. The stakes for the state are far too high to rest solely on periodic oversight hearings and audits. Let me summarize by stressing that none of this is necessarily meant to be critical of the authority. The authority has made progress, and they are learning from experience. We know far more about the dimensions and challenges of high-speed rail in California now than we did even 2 years ago. With this acknowledged, the authority is now at the point where a lack of resolution of the issues we have discussed will make effective management and planning more and more difficult. The authority now needs guidance from the legislature about its plans and its funding. I will be available for questions with the rest of these. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, and Senators. Jessica Peters with the Legislative Analyst Office. A couple of weeks ago, our office released this report, which is our sort of high-level summary of the major features of high-speed rail's draft 2016 business plan, as well as the major issues that we have identified for you to consider. I believe you have a copy of this report in your packets. We've also put together a handout that looks sort of like this that you should have in your packet as well. And this handout is really just summarizing and pulling out some of the main highlights from our report, and that's what I'll be walking through today as I make my presentation. On page 1 of the handout, we just have an overview of what we will talk about in the presentation. We provide some background information on the high-speed rail project, identify the major changes proposed in the draft business plan, and the major issues for legislative consideration. On page 2 and 3 of the handout, we have some background information on the cost, scope, and schedule of the high-speed rail system from the prior business plans. And this information is important because the changes in the draft 2016 business plan are relative to these prior approved figures. And so I think many of them have been touched on already. I'll walk through the key ones very quickly. On page 2, we have just written down for you some of the key criteria of Prop 1A that the authority has already spoken about. We also have the prior cost and schedule estimate for completion of phase 1 of the system, the San Francisco to Anaheim line. Previously in 2012 and 2014, the authority had estimated that the entire phase 1 system would cost $68 billion and that it would be complete in 2028. Some additional background information for you on page 3 of the handout. In the 2012 and 2014 business plans, the authority planned, as you heard, for the initial operating segment to go south from Merced into the Los Angeles Basin. This initial operating segment, or IOS, was at the time estimated to cost $31 billion in capital costs and be completed by 2022. Initial construction on this segment began in the Central Valley. Also, the construction is pursuant to certain federal funding agreements. This initial segment was initially going to extend 130 miles from Madera to an area north of Bakersfield, and was going to cost $5.9 billion. The authority previously has received some funding for the project, including a total of $8.1 billion that have been provided to it, 3.7 from Proposition 1A funds that the legislature has appropriated to the authority, $3.5 billion in federal funds also that have been appropriated, and about $850 million in cap and trade auction revenues estimated through the end of the current year. In addition, as you know, the legislature has provided a 25% of cap and trade auction revenues continuous appropriation on an ongoing basis, and that will provide additional funding in the future to the extent those revenues are available. Turning to page 4 of the handout, the major features of the plan. As the authority has already discussed, one of the biggest changes in the plan is switching the initial operating segment from that previous iOS South now to an iOS North, connecting an area north of the city of Shafter in the Central Valley to downtown San Jose. You can see on the map, we compare the two initial operating segments. The darker, thinner shaded line from San Jose, stopping sort of in between the Kings Tulare and Bakersfield stations, would be the initial operating segment that they are currently planning. Hopefully you can see it on your map. The thicker, lighter shaded line from Merced into Los Angeles was what the authority had previously planned, and the dashed line in the middle of the map is the area that's currently under construction. This is the initial construction segment in the Central Valley. The iOS North that is proposed in the draft business plan would be a 239-mile segment. In its first year of operation, which the authority estimates would be 2025, they estimate that it would carry between 2.2 and 4.1 million passengers. The reason for the change in the operating segment is because the authority did not have sufficient funding to build the previously approved iOS South. Page 5 of the handout, the next major feature that we want to highlight for you in the business plan, and I think the authority did a good job of describing this already, so I'll just point you to the chart, is this is updating their cost and schedule for the entire Phase 1 system. As they noted already, the total cost estimate is $64.2 billion, and we provide in a chart there the breakdown of the different components, $7.3 billion for the initial construction segment, $13.4 billion to complete the initial operating segment to San Jose, $2.9 billion for the extension that they've discussed to Bakersfield as well as San Francisco, and $40.6 billion for the remainder of Phase 1. On page 6 of the handout, I want to point out the last two major features of that we would like to highlight for you. The plan identifies full funding for the proposed iOS North. Specifically, the plan identifies about $28 billion in funds for this initial operating segment. This includes $6.8 billion from Proposition 1A. $4.2 billion of this has not been appropriated to the authority, and this would require legislative action to do so. $3.2 billion in federal funds. These are the same funds that have already been appropriated. And the plan assumes $17.8 billion in cap and trade auction revenues through the year 2050. This includes $5.3 billion through 2024 that would be used to fund the project on a pay-as-you-go basis, and about $13 billion from 2025 through 2050. And those future cap and trade revenues would actually be securitized under their plan and brought forward in order to fund construction costs in the nearer term. Of the $12 to $13 billion for financing, about $5.2 billion would be financing proceeds, and the remaining $7 to $8 billion would be used to pay financing costs on the project. And the last major feature of the plan is that it assumes that additional funding will become available to complete phase one of the system. As we show on the previous chart, once the initial operating segment is completed, the authority would have about $44 billion in additional costs in order to complete the rest of the phase one system. The business plan does not identify a full funding plan to complete phase one of the project. The authority in the business plan, they do discuss certain potential revenue sources, such as securitizing operating revenues from the system when they get an operable segment, as well as they discuss, as they had presented earlier, seeking additional federal funds for the project. On page 7 of the handout, we have the first major issue for your consideration. And this is that the business plan has some uncertainties regarding the phase one funding plan. I'll talk about this in two separate components. First is uncertainties relative to the funding plan for the initial operating segment north, or the valley to valley line as the authority is calling it. I think first we want to say that the potential for having a full funding plan of this segment is greater than some of the previous business plans that the authority has put together. They have identified funding sources, but there is some uncertainty. About half of the revenues that they are counting on in the plan to fund the construction of the iOS North would come from cap and trade auction revenues after the year 2020. Current law does not appear to authorize the program beyond that time, and so there is, at a minimum, some significant legal uncertainty regarding the availability of those funds. I think, in our view, we think the legislature would need to take an action to extend the program in order to make those funds available. We think that as you're considering cap and trade, you're going to want to evaluate that program based on the merits of that program as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to the extent that you do approve that program to continue, then the funds could be available for high-speed rail as well as other purposes. If this legal uncertainty is resolved, we also think that additional steps would need to be taken by the legislature in order to facilitate the type of cap and trade securitization that the authority discusses in its business plan. I think our comments on this are similar to what the peer review group has said, so I won't go into that again, but I think we have the same views in terms of needing to have additional legislative action there in order to facilitate that. The second piece of the funding uncertainty is relative to the remainder of phase one. The authority does not have a complete funding plan to finish building out phase one. And if under their business plan, they would essentially exhaust all of the money that they have identified in order to build the initial operating segment north, leaving a roughly $40 billion, $44 billion funding gap to complete the remainder of the system. We think that it is essential that the authority develops a comprehensive and credible plan for building out the remainder of the phase one system. And understanding the funding risks is going to be an important issue for the legislature to consider as you continue to review this plan. On page 8 of the handout, the next issue that we want to highlight for your consideration is the scope of the initial operating segment. First, you'll need to weigh the trade-offs of the proposed scope change. The initial operating segment south that was previously proposed would have traveled into a much more populous region of the state and had higher projected ridership. On the downside, the authority does not have the funding to complete that. And so to the extent that the legislature wants to ensure the continued development of a high-speed rail system, we think that the scope change makes some sense because it's much more likely that the authority could put together a full funding package to actually meet the costs of this iOS North. And primarily that's because the capital costs of that are about $10 billion less than the previously proposed iOS South. If the legislature agrees with this scope change, you're going to want to consider that in concept, if you agree, you're going to want to consider that the specific changes that are made, that the initial operating segment would have some standalone value. As I said before, the authority would exhaust all identified funding sources in order to build this initial operating segment. And so it's $30 billion, and you're going to want to ensure that the scope of this is something that meets your priorities, and that is something that has standalone value and makes sense on its own to the extent that the authority is not able to complete phase one of the system on the schedule that they have identified. In particular, we think you may want to consider whether or not the southern terminus as proposed by the authority makes sense. It does not appear to us to be a very effective approach, as the rail line would end in an agricultural area north of the city of Shafter. The specific location, not the city of Shafter, but the specific location where the rail line would actually end, does not have the types of facilities that train passengers would need. Parking structures and transit connections, rental car facilities, businesses, a place for, train passengers to get a cup of coffee, those sorts of things are just not there at that location. And so you may want to consider directing the authority to limit work beyond the last permanent southern station, which is the Kings Tulare station near Hanford. You may also want to make it a priority to identify the funding to extend the line into Bakersfield. You have options there. And that's something that you may want to put some focus into and not necessarily just go with the current version of the authority's plan and having it stop at its current southern terminus. And on page 9 of the handout, the last issue is just ensuring that there's adequate legislative oversight of the project. I think we share some of the views of the peer review group on this, just in terms of the importance of having, ongoing and robust oversight. The one thing that we wanted to really point out is that in terms of the legislature doing oversight, you need information that you can compare over time to understand and track changes on the project. And one of the challenges that we've noticed is that the way the information is presented to the legislature from one business plan to the next or from one legislative report to the next, it can be very challenging to understand when there's a change reported in cost or schedule, why that is the case, because there's so many moving parts. And an example that I'll give is for the initial construction segment. So I said earlier, when that segment was initially proposed and information was presented to the legislature, it was going to cost $5.9 billion and it was going to be 130 miles. Now the authority is indicating that that will cost $7.3 billion and it'll be 118 miles. And it's very difficult to understand why the cost is higher and why the scope is lower and how all of those changes relate to one another without having more detailed information. And so it's really unclear to us what the reasons for the change in cost are. I think the authorities indicated this. They've also added certain elements of scope within the miles that they've been looking at doing. And so it's very difficult for you to be able to understand why these costs are changing, if it's an increase, if it's a change of scope, and to have the information you need to really hold the authority to be accountable. And so we think that you may want to consider establishing certain scopes or certain core information that you have provided in a consistent manner over time, and that we think that would really help facilitate legislative oversight of the project. Thank you for having us here today. I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now hear from the local agencies. three representative local agencies to come forward. We have, I think Art Leahy's here, Jim Harnett, and Michael Turner. And then we'll have a question and answer with the committee. Discussion. Welcome.